The point of a revolution is not to instantly produce the perfect end state that motivates or is promised by the revolution, right? The point of a revolution, the point of a rebellion, is to denaturalize the existing order of things. I'm Professor Stephen Dyson.
And I'm Professor Jeff Dudas.
And we are two political scientists who have just rewatched Rogue One, a Star Wars story, in the afterglow of the end of Andor. We wanted to see how having seen Andor would change our views of Rogue One, a movie we've both seen and watched several times and liked and analysed actually in the past. We want to break down the political themes that we see in Rogue One and also talk about Rogue One as a cinematic experience again in the aftermath of Andor.
Yeah.
So let's maybe start there as a sort of heat check. How does having seen Andor change your viewing experience of Rogue One?
So as you say, we have spent a lot of time with Rogue One prior to this. And in the past, I've always been very positive on Rogue One. And I think that comes through. We did a couple of years ago now, one of our first pods was analyzing Rogue One. And we were both very positive and found the film to be very evocative and meaningful.
The most political Star Wars, we call it.
Is what we titled it. And up to that point, it was undoubtedly true. I felt like this time watching it in, as you say, the afterglow of Andor, I found the movie to be a little less substantial than I remember it being. I found it to be a bit thinner in terms of character development. And it felt very rushed to me, which is not surprising given that we have spent 2 full seasons kind of luxuriating in character development and in some of these exact same characters themselves. And I will say for me that I had a pretty different experience watching it again after Andor than I had had previously. And while I still think that it's a good and successful movie, I will have to admit that some of the sheen has been taken off of it.
That's really, really interesting. So I enjoyed it again, as I always do. I'm not sure I don't think it's sort of fallen in my estimation in the way that it has for you. I think it now depends on what we regard it as. Like, what is this movie doing? So it's in a very interesting position that it's had to do several very difficult things in its life, right? It has to, first of all, function just as a standalone movie. Secondly, it has to and sort of be successful in audience terms, in getting people to go to the cinema. It has to function in terms of the wider mythos as a prequel to A New Hope, into which it directly leads, and a movie that everyone knows word for word since their childhood. And that's a very difficult task. Prequels, just as structural storytelling devices, are genuinely very difficult tasks. I genuinely don't like almost any prequels because they have just obvious structural problems, right? You know what's going to happen to the characters. You know certain things must happen, certain people must live and must die. So that's a very difficult task. And now it has another layer of complexity kind of thrust upon it posthumously, which is it has to function as the series finale to a critically lauded, heavily analyzed, beautifully done,
Yes,
2-season run of Andor. And I think that's a lot of weight for a single movie to bear.
it really is. And I think that's a really sharp point. I think it really depends on how we view it. As a prequel, I think it is super successful. As a standalone story, I think it's slightly less successful simply because it requires the viewer to have you have to know who Darth Vader is, and you have to know what's going to happen at the beginning of A New Hope in order to understand the kind of the weight or the gravity of that last
But everyone does know that, right? These are things that people know in the ether.
Most people do, for sure. It now, as you say, it has to act as the concluding act in Andor, and I'm wondering if it's starting to groan under the weight of all of these different roles. Rogue One starting to groan under the weight of all of these different roles that it is being sort of tasked with as a story. I also thought this time, in ways that again is undoubtedly informed by having spent 2 seasons with Tony Gilroy's vision of Andor, I thought this time I could start to see the production problems that Rogue One infamously had, right? Or it was more obvious to me the things that Gilroy brought in after Gareth Edwards had turned in the initial cut, and what was originally there. And it felt like more of a kind of a bricolage storytelling to me. You could see bits and pieces now of the different visions. For Gareth Edwards, he famously claimed, this is a war movie. It's a war movie. I want it to be a distinct and obvious throwback to the kind of genre of war movies. And for sure, that is in there in several of the scenes, probably most prominently in the Scarif.
Like the last act, the last 50 minutes or whatever, is a pretty self-contained war movie.
Right. And as it turned out, and to the extent that Gilroy has talked about what he did as they sort of brought him into firefight at the end of production, he seems to suggest that the stuff that he did, the stuff that he wrote, the scenes that they reworked were all character development scenes. And you can really begin to see that, right? Because it's clear that Edwards' vision of the war movie is not one that spends a whole lot of time doing things like character development. It doesn't spend a whole lot of time exploring motivation. For a kind of classic war movie, all of that is supposed to emerge from or articulate within the action sequence itself. And Gilroy is bringing a different kind of vision to what this text needs to do. And I thought you could start to see some of the seams of the construction this time, watching it again in the aftermath of Andor. And maybe that is also something about why I found it to be a little clunkier.
Well, so it was always true that when you watch Rogue One, there's sort of infamously the first, 15 minutes, I haven't timed this out, but there's where you cut from Wobani to Yavin 4 to Ring of Kafrines, and you're like, wait, who's that and what are they doing and what's the relationship? And I think in that sense, Rogue One benefits from Andor more than Andor benefits from Rogue One. It's Rogue One, what is going on at the start of Rogue One is made explicable by Andor.
Right.
And in particular, someone like Saw Gerrera, who was sort of mysterious. I presume he has again, we don't go deep into the lore or off on the internet. We tend to take these things as text on screen. Yeah. I'm sure some people will tell us in the comments, Saw Gerrera has a long life in Star Wars Rebels or some sort of extra, not extra canonical, you know what I'm saying, extra filmic kind of text. But if you just met him for the first time in Rogue One, you're like, wait, what's this guy doing and why is he here and what? And he's placed much more in context.
Yes,
by having seen him in Andor, and kind of what the breathing is about and all the rest of it. So that really helps. I wonder if what you're feeling is this. That there's a structural problem introduced into this story, into the story of Rogue One, and that structural problem is Jyn Erso. Okay, and what you've got going on in Rogue One is a highly accelerated, compressed character arc that they just about, you can see the areas of panic where you're like, we've got to get her from this motivation to this motivation and explain this. You can see it's being done very quickly, but they just about pull it off in Rogue One, where she has to go on the fairly classic characterological arc from kind of apathetic actor. It's actually the classic arc of all revolutionary films, rebellion films. Apathetic actor to engaged, agentic, revolutionary hero. Yeah. And she has to do it, I was going to say in the 2 hours of the runtime, but that's not true because there's so many other things that have to be accomplished. She has to do it in the amount of the runtime that's devoted to her character. Right. And it's quick. And then you just about get away with it in Rogue One. The structural problem that's introduced once you've seen Andor is it's the same arc that Cassian has just been on, that's taken 2 seasons. And so we saw him go from apathetic actor to engaged revolutionary over the course of however many hours.
Multiple years.
Exactly. Yeah. And you could kind of see every beat in his development and you sort of live it with him and so forth. And it is slightly jarring to sort of see another person go through that in a short period of time. And it also, there's not many moments where you're kind of thrown out of Rogue One now by saying, but in Andor that happened, so why are we now doing this? But there are some moments in Rogue One where that happens, and some of them are when Andor starts deferring to her on like military decisions. Right. And you're like, I know she's the protagonist of this movie, but we actually know, and the movie begins with Cassian being an experienced guerrilla fighter, and then he's like, what should we do in this situation? And Cassian looks at her and she's like, do it or launch the thing. And he's like, okay, well now we can. And you do kind of wonder, what is the dynamic between those two and how has it evolved?
Yeah, I agree. And that's a really sharp point. And it also comes out sort of in the beginning, the action, the sequence that takes us into the third act, where it's Jyn Erso's kind of revolutionary awakening or consciousness that inspires all these other people. Well, we know that the rebels have been doing this now for years on Yavin 4. It's clear that Andor himself is looked up to as a kind of aspirational figure because it's been earned. Right? These people have been living with this guy. They've been around him. They can see the sort of mystique and the weight that Cassian carries with him. And then to find that, subverted so quickly into a subsidiary role by somebody who's a literal newcomer, who has no bona fides with the rebellion at all, is jarring. You're right.
Yeah. Although she does have some. I mean, in fairness to the movie, but it's hard. It's actually hard to reconstruct her backstory. It's only on this viewing, I think, that I fully understood. So she was a fighter for Saw Gerrera.
Sometime with Saw Gerrera.
Yeah, up until she's 16.
Yeah. So, but that feels like a decade ago, maybe. I think she's supposed to be in her 20s.
Yeah,
is the sense that I'm getting.
Yeah. So the movie begins. She's just an itinerant petty criminal. She's Cassian, right? Really, really interesting to view it in this light. I do think that it's significant that the last episode of Andor was called, I'm going to get the order of things wrong, but it's like Jeddah, Kyber, Erso. And it's almost like the last episode in its title is telling us, remember these things for Rogue One, because they're things that seem really kind of mysterious, just words when they're kind of thrown at you in the movie.
Yeah.
And if you remember Claire in the last episode, she keeps reciting it because she's got to remember the pieces of information, and that's actually the experience you have when you start watching.
The audience to remember as well.
Yeah. So when it comes up again, don't be kind of so lost. Yeah, I'm a little more positive on it even after this rewatch, because I think it's given a structurally difficult task, and it's sort of remarkable it doesn't collapse under its own weight. I guess also this is sort of our different reactions are a lesson in how much your reactions depend upon through what frame you're viewing a text. And I'm minded to view this as a bridge text between Andor and New Hope. And I think it works in that context, in that it's occupying a median position between the two.
Yeah.
On several dimensions, right? So what is the arc from Andor to A New Hope being in sort of story and sort of political terms? It's from small scale to large scale. Right? Mm-hmm. It's from ordinary people to mythic heroes. Mm-hmm. And it's from the very secular to the very religious, right? It's from no force to everything is Jedi and Sith and all the rest of it. And Rogue One, it would be very jarring to go from Andor, a small scale secular world, ordinary people world, to knights and lightsabers and the Force and large-scale hero's journey things. You need an intermediate stage, and I think Rogue One kind of nails that. It's exactly in that intermediate position. So small scale to large scale. Krennic is a big fish in Andor.
Yep.
You're now showing he's a little fish in Rogue One. The scale of the largest thing you see in Andor is, do you see a Star Destroyer? You do. Mm-hmm. But that's like the largest thing you see. Almost instantly in Rogue One, we're shown Star Destroyers being absolutely dwarfed by the completed Death Star.
Yeah.
In Andor, the most forcelithic. I don't know what the word would be. The most forceful.
Yeah.
The most force using type of thing you see is this kind of force healer.
Yeah.
Who might just be a artist, right? But who does seem to have some kind of uncanny sort of abilities, right? Whereas by the end of Rogue One, but only by the very end, crucially, you see Vader, and you're like, all right, actually, this really does exist. We are in a world in which the supernatural is real. And so Rogue One kind of neatly accomplishes that kind of bridge function, I see.
Yeah, I agree. That's a sharp point, and it would be too jarring, right, to go from, say, end of season 1 Andor to A New Hope. And it is this kind of progressive, as you say, the storytelling works because it's this progressive diminution of ordinary people and this progressive kind of elevation of elite heroes. And it goes back to another point that you had made in one of our Andor pods about the difference between ordinary characters and these kinds of legacy family line characters, right, in which what matters is the bloodline. That effectively doesn't really exist all that much in the Andor world, but all of a sudden by the time that Rogue One comes around, it's not just the introduction of Vader. It's also, right, there's the explicit reference then when Mon Mothma says to Leia's father, right, we're going to need your friend, And who's she talking about? She's talking about Obi-Wan Kenobi. The movie, I think, still does work, you're right, as that kind of bridge mechanism. And I think that's a really good point. It's how you see it. It's how you frame the experience as a viewer. What is it that Rogue One is trying to do? And as a bridge piece, as a standalone piece, I still think it's pretty successful. I'm not sure, though, as a concluding piece to what we see in Andor, that it's super satisfying.
Yeah, finales are impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very, very difficult to do them. I think we might have said that in the last Andor pod, that you can't think of many shows that kind of nail a finale, and that there are just structural reasons in storytelling why, you know, finales are going to alienate whole rafts of people who believed the story was one thing and it's something else. All right, I want to shift to a more explicitly political analysis, and I want to suggest there's a structural political reason why finales are very hard to nail, or why, you know, in your view, and to some extent in my view, Rogue One doesn't quite nail it as a finale. And that's because this text writ large, Andor Rogue One at least, and then into New Hope and beyond if you like, but Andor and Rogue One, this is a text about revolutionary politics, okay? And it's about treating revolutionary politics through the lens of utopianism. Utopianism is the central frame through which scholars study science fiction, right? A utopia being a world that is not our world, but is closely enough related to our world that it can comment upon it. And a utopia being a world that, you know, doesn't exist and we're probably never going to get there, but is morally different from our world, either morally better, the utopia, or the positive utopia, or morally worse, the negative utopia, or sometimes called the dystopia. And that's the basic framework that a lot of scholarly analysis of science fiction operates from. And I think Andor Rogue One, I would say, should be seen through that framework, okay? And why does the finale not land? It's because utopian politics is never ending, right? The point of a utopian politics is not to reach a finale. The point of a revolution is not to instantly produce the perfect end state that motivates or is promised by the revolution, right? The point of a revolution, the point of a rebellion, is to denaturalize the existing order of things. It's to problematize, in this case, the empire, which is trying to say, we are the natural order. We provide order. We provide justice. We are the normatively proper, kind of righteous people in this world. And the rebellion is saying, no, you are unnatural. That's, what's his name's Nimic's manifesto.
Yeah.
That, you know, tyranny is unnatural. Freedom is the natural thing. And we're being told this imposed thing is natural and it's not unnatural. The point of a revolution is to denaturalize that. And it's to promise some unattainable things, something much, much better, some utopia, because you're not going to give your life up for what the rebellion is actually going to produce, which is, there's still going to be a world of iniquity. There's still going to be a world where it's almost impossible to impose solid government that everyone agrees with. It's still going to be a world in which people die, but we're going to be 10% better than the Empire. We're going to, you know, commit 10% fewer moral atrocities, right? People are not going to die for that. They want to die for a pure and whole vision. But that pure and whole vision is unachievable. It's never going to be achieved. It's always an ongoing process. So I suppose I wonder if I can bat this ball at you, and I'm sorry, this is a many-shaped object, but I hope you're kind of following along. You can't have a finale to a show about revolutionary politics, because revolutionary politics don't have finales. They have failed revolutions. If the end goal is a utopia, the revolution is always a failure. But the failure in and of itself is the success. The success is getting rid of the status quo order of things.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm trying to say to you there?
I think maybe another way of thinking through this is that revolutions offer themselves as kind of a political paradox. They are, as you say, on one hand, the means to achieving something, or the intended means to achieving a state of affairs that is better in one way or another, right? At least according to the revolutionary point of view, than what currently exists. So there is this need to take what exists currently, to politicize it, right? To raise consciousness around the existing state of affairs, as you say, to denaturalize things. Things could be different. The state of affairs that we are currently laboring under is the product of human decision-making. It is not natural. It need not be this. And so accordingly, as the product of human decision making, we could make different decisions, and we could bring about a different state of affairs. And so revolution or rebellion becomes this kind of means towards change. But it also, to the extent, as you say, that revolution is yoked to a kind of utopian vision of not just better, but the best, right? A utopian vision suggests, in fact, the end of politics, right? That we have reached a state of affairs in which there are no controversies, right? In which there are no need to engage in consistent and meaningful collective moments of decision-making and interaction, because everybody already knows, again, naturally, how things are going to work, right? Utopia is aspirational in that way. And what the utopian reality promises is the end of politics. But what revolution insists upon is that there is no end to politics. It is just an ongoing cycle or method according to which change is pursued or upended. And so there's this kind of paradoxical element to it. And I think you're right. This is why, in a certain way, this is why the finale to Andor season 2 is more satisfying, because it can look at Rogue One and say, see, this is the actual finale, right? And so Andor season 2 keeps open, even though we know, as an audience, we know what's going to happen in Rogue One. Nevertheless, when you inhabit that kind of ethos of storytelling, in the final episode, it does feel open. The realities do still feel open. Different things could still change, right? It does still feel like there's a kind of a cyclical process to what's happening here. Rogue One representing, as you say, it is a transition, right, in storytelling, but it is also an end. And to the extent that it's an end, it kind of grates harshly against its revolutionary ethos, right? And this is the paradoxical character of the politically paradoxical character of rebellion and revolution.
I wonder how hard it grates. I mean, that one thing, I think the best thing about Rogue One has always been that it kills all its characters, right? That's always been the bravest and the most interesting thing, and a really neat way to get around the problem of prequels, which is, well, you know that person must die or must not die because we have not seen them in the subsequent movies, and it sort of neatly disassembles itself, which is an interesting story trick, an interesting trick in kind of the arc of a cinematic franchise. But it's also an important revolutionary or utopian point, because the reason why you can never reach a utopia if you're a revolutionary or an ordinary person is that by very dint of living in a situation, living in a system that needs a revolution, that needs to be changed, by the very dint of living in a system that is not already utopic, you are damaged. You know, violence is done to you, sometimes literally, but certainly morally, but by living in that system, which means you have not the moral cognitive capacities to envisage what the best possible world could be. Now, it's important upon you, and this is what being a human being is, and certainly being a revolutionary, to have the courage of your convictions, right? The most courageous thing is to take a moral stand and to be willing to take risks and pay prices to forward a moral vision, even though you know it's not perfect, because it can't be perfect, because you're not an advanced enough person to achieve that perfection. And why are you not? It's because you've grown up in the empire. You've grown up in, if you happen to be an anti-capitalist, a capitalist system, right? So you of course have habits of thought and ways of going about things that kind of embody or instantiate or continue that system of being. And so why does everyone have to die in Andor and in Rogue One, right? Why does Luthen have to die? There's a teleology of these things. Luthen has to die not only because the alliance, the Rebel Alliance is becoming more professionalized and militarized. He also has to die because he is at some level a bad man. And the rebellion needs to become better than him. And then why does Cassian have to die? He is at some level, he is a person who has existed within that structure of violence. They say in the movie, we're spies, we're saboteurs, we've done terrible things. They're sort of lost causes, right? Their greatest moral contribution is pushing the ball forward and creating a situation where the next generation is in a slightly better moral universe. But they're still going to be damaged people, and it's sort of endless story. And that's kind of why everyone has to die.
It's why everyone has to die. But I have a couple thoughts. The first is, it's also, we need to remember that the utopic promise is always itself impossible. And so
we should demand the impossible. That's the utopian rallying cry, and that you're right. It's an absolute paradox.
But it's not simply that people are damaged by living under systems of oppression, like in the Empire. People are damaged by living even in relatively functional systems by the way in which power works, and power is always there, and there are always winners, and there are always losers, and there are always a set of incentives that are either forwarded or distilled or suppressed that do damage to actual people in one way or another. And so the utopic promise of a politics-free society is itself an impossibility. The other thing that I was thinking about is that's so interesting in American iconography and in the history of American storytelling culture about the need for the revolutionary leaders here to die is that they become, the Luthans, the Cassians, they become in the Star Wars universe the equivalent of kind of the way that pioneers and other sorts of westward ho explorers and settlers are frequently treated in the American storytelling tradition, as the people who burst out from cloistered centers of power, from old world, literally imperial ties and social organizations, and light out into the wilderness to create something new, to blaze a new trail, to do war, in essence, with the harshest elements of what is on the edge of the frontier, and to blaze a trail for new forms of civilization and new forms of political organization to follow. And in the American storytelling tradition, those people serve their purpose, they serve a function, and then they either somehow manage to adapt themselves to whatever new form of civilized political order emerges, or they just die. And they are explicitly transitional figures and characters in the same way that we see in sort of the revolutionary context, but also just in the same way we see in Andor.
Yeah, and in Rogue One. Rogue One, I think, deals, maybe because it's a movie and you're just supposed to, deals more explicitly in this language of impossibility and dreaming and shared dreaming. At one point, Saw Gerrera says, it's actually at the point that he dies, right? Save the rebellion, save the dream. I think that's a crucial line. And at first you think, when Saw's like, I will run no more. And you're like, when he's you can't be bothered, or I don't like your legs giving you, peg legs giving you a bit of a jip. But no, actually, he's saying, like, I've run my course. I've run the end. K2SO, who keeps quoting the odds on it, the impossibility. You think at first it's comic relief. No, I think it's exactly to show these are irrational acts that are not going to pay off.
Yeah. And those are sharp points, and we'll return to those points for sure after our break.
And we are back with our breakdown of the political themes that are in Rogue One, particularly as we see them in the aftermath of Andor. We wanted to talk a little bit, Jeff, about the analog to weapons of mass destruction that presents itself in the shape of the Death Star. It's always present in the background of Andor, but it's really explicit in Rogue One. When the Death Star kind of launches an attack, it produces a mushroom cloud. Mm-hmm. There are obvious analogs between the process of Death Star development and things like the Manhattan Project in the United States, and they're actually quite well observed, and someone's really sort of looked into this, because to have a refinery for the kind of fuel, if you like, then to have a separate research and testing facility, then to have another separate facility. That's what the Manhattan Project was, right? It was a dispersed series of sites across parts of the United States. It certainly wasn't in Manhattan, right. and it certainly wasn't just in Los Alamos, New Mexico, which I presume is the analog to Scarif or Edu. Actually, maybe it's combined.
It's hard to say, right? But this is something. The WMD elements of this is something that we spent quite a bit of time talking about a few years ago when we first sat down to think about Rogue One, and It is. It's very obvious, and it's very on the nose here with the way that this text is presenting the Death Star as a nuclear weapon, effectively. As you say, it employs all of the hallmarks, the iconographic and visual hallmarks of nuclear weapons. And it also sets that Rogue One sets that within the context of ordinary war, ordinary battles, like on the ground battles as well. And as Andor goes on, it becomes increasingly important, right? And we do see all of the, the elements of its production, and we understand how long it takes to build. And it's the whole thing is done in a very sophisticated and clever storytelling way that I do think that is one of the most satisfying elements in storytelling from point of view from rewatching Rogue One now, is that we finally now see the Death Star full, complete, and wholly operational after we have been, in one way or another, from various different angles, exploring its production over the previous couple seasons of Andor.
Yeah. But there are crucial differences with the development of weapons mass destruction in our world and the development of the Death Star in this fictional world. The U.S. Manhattan Project did not operate in the way that the Empire's Death Star production project, goes forward.
It wasn't slave labor that produced.
No, it wasn't slave labor. I mean, the scientists that worked on the Manhattan Project were a mixture of leading American physicists. I mean, most famously Robert Oppenheimer, who was not the leading mind, but was put in charge of it because he was probably the most practically minded of the world-class physicists who were assembled. And so he was the one who could deal with General Groves, who was the military kind of overseer. Yeah. He was the one whose kind of personality best equipped him to deal with two very difficult organizations or types of people, a kind of political military structure. And General Groves was famously sort of very, hard driving and had imperatives of speed and secrecy and so forth. And then Oppenheimer also had to mediate with the academics, who are sort of a hugely, I mean, I don't mean to shock you, but many academics are sort of a hugely querulous bunch who won't work together, B, certainly won't work at the behest of authorities, outside authorities such as political military structures.
Yeah, I mean, that's a controversial statement. Well, I'll allow it.
Yeah, exactly. And so Krennic is probably closer to someone like Beria, who Stalin put in charge of the Soviet program. And Beria knew nothing about science, and I don't really think Krennic does. He's actually kind of an idiot, really, in scientific terms. But he did know how to crack heads, and that's kind of Krennic's maybe self-mythologizing. Galen Erso, I also don't think is Oppenheimer.
No.
Galen Erso sabotages the project, and Galen Erso is press ganged. And so, depending on your historiography, maybe he's closer to like a Heisenberg figure in the Nazi atomic program.
Yeah, or one of the figures from the American nuclear program who gives the secrets to those.
Oh, like a Klaus Fuchs.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. He's a mole, a spy, a saboteur.
I mean, the larger kind of structural issue here, I think that you're at least in part suggesting, is that there is no analog that the rebellion has to the Death Star.
Right.
So this isn't an arms race. And this does create, as I think you're going to talk maybe a little bit now, this does create some issues with regard to the purposes of the Death Star and what the point of the whole thing is.
Well, yeah, there is it's Palpatine's strategy, right? And Palpatine is, in one sense, a sort of, he must be an amazing strategist, right? He's someone who's managed in plain sight to have a full career as a very high profile senator and then, president/emperor, without his supernatural or evil, nature becoming known to literally the most, force-sensitive creatures. This is the full bloom of the Jedi Order is unable to sense what is going on. The way that guy's really a Sith, my goodness, amazing. And he's able to pull the wool over everyone's eyes. So he's clearly an orchestrated, an amazing sequence of events to actually amass most of his goals without having to come out in the open and kind of bash people on the head, to amass them through a subversion, but nonetheless an operation of the existing political processes. Great strategist. He clearly recognizes he has a difficulty in that this world is operating on two tracks. It's operating on a sort of supernatural track in which he's sort of the top dog, I guess. He's the most powerful force wielder, you know, the kind of preeminent Sith Lord. But force power is very personal, right? Like the lightsaber is a personal melee weapon. The force only works over, you know, in terms of mind control, and all of its useful things is very short range things. And space is absolutely huge.
Yeah.
So he needs to operate in the secular military political realm where his supernatural powers are not going to be the primary means of coercion or getting people to do what he wants. So he needs something like, he needs a variety of things, but he needs something like the Death Star, right? His structure of Star Destroyers and Moffs and Grand Moffs and all the rest of it is not going to cut it. He needs some cudgel that is above and beyond what he's been able to deploy. So he wants the Death Star. That makes sense. We know from A New Hope that, you know, when Tarkin says that the Death Star's purpose is to, like, scare everyone, right? And the people that it doesn't scare will just blow up. But there is a problem, right? Which is, how usable is this weapon? Like, it's usable to blow up cities, rebel bases. You can use it to eliminate kind of targets that you know where they are.
Yeah.
But what is the theory of governance behind the use of the Death Star, right? Like, fear will only get you so far. Is the plan really to cart this thing around and blow up every world one by one? And then what are you emperor of, right? And this was a problem that nuclear strategists faced in the United States, right? There always has been a paradox in nuclear weapons in that they're immensely powerful, but they're probably unusable for anything except deterring the use of nuclear weapons by other nuclear armed states. And the whole history of the American military think tank establishment throughout the entire Cold War was to try and develop an actual strategy by which nuclear weapons could be used towards some sort of practical foreign policy purpose. And you actually found that they couldn't be used to any practical purpose. Literally, their only use was deterrence, because once you started using them, things got out of control and you essentially destroyed the entire world. Maybe the analogy is to that brief period of time where America's a nuclear hegemon.
Yeah.
Well, but again, you know, America, this was considered. What should we do? Should we try and maintain this period of perpetual nuclear hegemony? Well, what would that mean? It would mean you'd have to go to war sequentially with every power in the system that tries to develop a nuclear weapon, and probably be willing to use nuclear weapons on multiple countries that don't have nuclear weapons, like to destroy the nascent Soviet program, and then do it again and again when the Soviets rebuild it. And then what world do you live in? And is that sustainable? Because do you not provoke total counterbalancing rebellion against you immediately?
Yeah.
And then do you kill everyone?
Yeah. Well, I wonder if this is somehow related to the continuing campaign to obfuscate the existence of the Death Star, which we continue to see in Rogue One. Vader tells Krennic, the Senate doesn't know this exists. Right? We're not telling them that this exists. And so it does suggest that Palpatine doesn't only see the Death Star as a kind of physical projection of self into all elements of the star system. That it's clear that that Palpatine still sees a need for other, maybe more conventional forms of governance, right? Persuasion, lying, obfuscation, double talk, the kinds of things that espionage, the kinds of things that we see so clearly in Andor. And so that might be a way to kind of square the circle here, right? That maybe Palpatine is envisioning the Death Star for the hard cases, right? The rebel bases, right? The particularly recalcitrant planets that are sort of a lost hope, so to speak.
Yeah.
And in empires, in terms of the Empire. And maybe the Death Star is not intended to be used all that often, and not intended to be used out in the open, at least in its original vision.
I mean, it's clear Vader doesn't think he thinks it's worthless, right?
Yeah, but yes.
I mean, doesn't he follow it like
doesn't have a vision of governance.
Right.
Right. Vader is he's a loyal soldier, frankly. Right. He essentially does what Palpatine wants him to do. It's the moment where he stops obeying that is both his redemption and his death.
Yeah, but he calls it like it's in New Hope, he calls it like a technological monstrosity says it's not going to be as effective as don't underestimate the Force. This technological monstrosity, blah blah blah, is in no way. He said when
part of it also goes to what you were talking about earlier, the personalized force of the Force, right? That is everything to Vader. Everything is these kind of like interpersonal moments in which he exerts dominance.
Right. So once Krennic and Tarkin between them can't solve this problem of deploying the Death Star in a reasonable way, keeping it secret for long enough, then coming up with reasonable ways to use it. Once Vader has to get involved in this, I mean, he's crossed the streams, right? Like the secular and the religious.
Yeah.
I mean, it's already failed.
Yeah.
Right at that point, and Palpatine's whole vision, for it to work, it had to be, used in a very judicious way, and it had to be usable within the realm of the secular without the need for the supernatural intervention that Vader represents, right?
Yeah.
And his lackeys proved that they couldn't deploy it in a sensible way.
And there's another way of reading this as well, which is that the Death Star is just it's the folly of extreme power, right? It's the folly of extreme ego. And that's what Palpatine is doing, right? Well, what does the most important and powerful person in the world need? Well, they need the most powerful and important weapon that's ever been built. And so it becomes a monument to Palpatine's ego rather than an effective weapon or geopolitical tool.
One of the best political moments in the film, I think, comes when the Rebel fleet goes off to Scarif. It goes rogue, right? So there's really two Rogue One. Rogue One is the shuttle that takes Cassian and all the rest of it down to the planet. Rogue 2 is Radis when he just says, like, screw this, I'm going off to fight.
Yeah.
And one of the best moments is, when Mon Mothma is informed that there's rebels on Scarif, and she says, well, I need to speak to Radis, and you're like, you can't, he's gone to fight.
Yeah. And
a little smile plays across her face. So this is the dream of every liberal coalition builder. It is that someone takes decisive action to break the deadlock and solves the political problem, even though it's been solved outside of her realm of consensus-seeking liberal politics.
Yeah, and I think Rogue One is really good, again, in relation to the way that Andor Season 2 sets up, particularly that last arc, sets up what we know is going to be the dysfunctions of the Yavin 4 leadership council.
Right.
The same characters in Andor who were shown to be, querulous and difficult and not particularly sophisticated about the nature of the rebellion that they're a part of. Well, they're the same people who behave like that in Rogue One. It's important that, I mean, as I recall, the Rogue One sequence takes place after the council has essentially broken up, right? After Bail Organa has left, right? And what we learned in Andor is that Bail Organa is also he ends up being kind of a roadblock as well, right? A blockage, so to speak, in the process of rebellion in a way that I don't know that we had seen as an audience before. So he needs to be out of the way for all of this to work as well. And there is that, you're right, Mon Mothma's smile is satisfying, but it also feels like it's hard-earned over the course of several years now, in which she really has been the most important political figure in the rebellion, but has in a variety of ways been usurped or forced to kind of like hide just how important and influential of a vision and of a voice that she has.
I think you wanted to talk a little bit about Saw Gerrera and maybe some of the parallels to Vader.
Yeah, he reads Saw Gerrera does very differently now after having spent more time with him. And again, we're only talking about the Saw Gerrera that we see on screen, either in Rogue One or in Andor. But we had talked maybe in the second arc of our discussion of Season 2 of Andor about the different styles and theories of leadership that each of the rebel leaders and each of the Imperial leaders who we saw present on screen. And when we talked about Saw Gerrera's leadership style, it is this kind of charismatic individual leadership style in which the leader draws to them a series of followers, and that the lines of loyalty really depend upon following the almost preternatural instinctual capacities, strategic and organizational, of the leader themselves. And so we talked about how the big benefit of the charismatic leadership style is that there is no controversy about who's in charge. But the big drawback is that once that person dies, once their vision is expended or somehow they are removed from the scenario, the organization itself tends to fall apart, because what has not happened is any kind of learning, and what has absolutely not happened is to plan for any kind of line of succession. And this is a highly personalized style and charismatic style of leadership that is the same as we have been mentioning, that Darth Vader uses. The difference is the characters are a little different, though, because Vader himself is not actually in charge of the Empire, right? He's taking his orders from Palpatine, whereas Saw Gerrera is in charge of this kind of splinter rebel group, and he infamously cannot get along with the rest of them. He refuses to get along with the rest of the rebel elements, and he finds himself as exactly that sort of character that you were referring to earlier, who basically has to die. He's a rebellion figure who is not going to be able to make his way productively in a larger organization or social and political structure. He's got to be this kind of, rogue figure. So we see Saw Gerrera, for those of us who are just seeing him on screen, we really see him on the big screen for the first time in Rogue One. And there's a lot of super interesting things. We learn about his various disabilities, right? He's perhaps not more machine than man in the way that Vader infamously is more machine than man, but there's a lot of machine now.
He does say this, there's not much of me left.
There's not much of me left. He's also constantly taking hits off of a mask. And for sure, I think this read prior to season 2 of Andor is taking like oxygen hits. Now I think we're supposed to see this. He's not taking hits of oxygen. He's like huffing the gas fumes that he, is addicted to, that we see in Andor season 2. And I think it's meaningful that as soon as he's much more lively and sort of at his most paranoid elements in Rogue One, immediately after after huffing the gas. And then you had mentioned that there is a real parallel here in the way that Saw Gerrera's end comes and the way that Vader's end will eventually come in Return of the Jedi.
Yeah, so both of them are kind of in a situation where people are leaving and Luke says to Vader, like, I'll take you with me, Father, and we can fix you up and everything. And Cassian doesn't say to Saw, like, stay here, you're going to slow us down, right? They also want Saw to come with them.
Yeah.
And both Vader and Saw Gerrera are saying, no, like, our race is run, I'm going to stay here, I will run no more. And both of them have basically the same final thing they do physically, which is Vader removes, he says, let me see you with my own eyes.
Yeah.
And he takes his breathing apparatus and his helmet and all the rest of it off. And Saw, if you watch, the last thing he does is he throws away, that gas so he can breathe air or be free of that addiction or whatever.
Yeah.
So there is a real sort of parallel between them. Yeah. I think, but also a bit of a difference. And I think it's not just a parallel like, oh, that's cool, and we can use the Vader sound effect when Saw appears on screen. It'll make everyone go, is that Vader? There are also different points being made about the moral nature of the political structure within which they're embedded, right? Because Vader, as you say, takes orders and Saw doesn't. Yeah. Okay, so that's important in and of itself, right? The rebellion is annoyed by Saw, finds him to create problems, but ultimately it's a liberal, tolerant rebellion. They don't think of assassinating him. Right. What Palpatine did was break Vader, right? He broke him and made him obedient. And Vader is, Vader's worth is all tied up in the degree to which he's been caused pain and being kind of destroyed by Palpatine. And that's where all the motive force comes from. Whereas from Saw, it comes from, he doesn't like the Empire. He's a kind of wild guerrilla type fighter. Yeah. And he huffs gas. Yeah. And there's a libertine element to, Saw is huffing gas and there's a libertine element to that. Vader is embedded in this very painful suit just to be kept alive as a result of injuries that Palpatine didn't directly cause, but caused to happen to him, and is kind of imprisoned. And there is sort of a difference in the politics of the two sides, or the morality of the two sides, in even how they treat these parallel figures.
Right. And we know, just to continue the thought, we know that Palpatine will happily sacrifice Vader if it serves the larger.
Yeah, he wanted Luke, didn't he? As a more powerful.
And so it's hard to. It would be hard to imagine the Yavin 4 Council sending out, as you say, the same kind of hit on Saw Gerrera.
Right.
They just sort of tolerate his presence, even as they are exasperated by it.
Yeah, exactly. All right, I think we want to start bringing this to an end. My big fear in watching Rogue One this time was there'd be multiple times where they'd say something and you'd go, honk, that's not true. That, no, we know from Andor that he doesn't say that and she doesn't. And there's very few moments that I caught one that I think is, and again, these nitpicks are by definition small matters that, that nonetheless occur to you or bother you a little bit. There was one moment where they're imprisoned in Saw Gerrera's kind of holding cells, and Bodhi's in one cell and Cassian's in another, and they have this conversation about being in a cage. And Cassian's like, I don't like cages, and the other guy's like, I'm used to them, and Cassian says, oh, this is a first to me. Well, we do know Cassian's been imprisoned in a case. I mean, it's a lot wider and cleaner and more pristine, but it's not actually his first time in a cage.
Right. I was wondering if there are more generous ways to read that.
I'm sure there are.
And one way would be to say, well, he's never been encaged by someone who would loosely be an ally.
Yeah, that's true.
Right. Also, if we think back to Narkina, like, it's not the physicality of the bars, right? they're surrounded by sort of high tech. It's a high tech prison rather than a cage. So maybe you think of it in that way, and you can find some generosity in the.
I'm sure you can, but I don't think that's what happened. I think they just, they missed it, or they were like, yeah, whatever. Yeah. So fine. Did you have any nitpicks that came up, or anything?
Not really. Not really. I mean, I think that, like I said, I think the through lines with the Yavin 4 Council are really well done.
Yeah.
And I think the reason that there probably aren't a lot of these continuity nitpicks is because Tony Gilroy was working on both of those things. And I think that to the extent that Gilroy was most interested in character development during Rogue One, it makes a lot of sense that there'd be clear lines of continuity, and or at least nothing that grates too harshly when Gilroy is returning to a lot of these characters and explicitly taking the time to develop them over the course of Andor.
Yeah, and I read an interview actually just this morning with the guy who, it wasn't Gilroy, but it was one of the writers, the guy who wrote the last 3 episodes, and he said he went back to, the key thing about the last 3 episodes, and particularly the last episode of season 2 of Andor, was trying to figure out who would know what at what point, and how you would match up the kind of end of Andor with the state of information in Rogue One. And I think it does work. I was worried that wouldn't, but it's, I was worried I'd watch Rogue One and they're all confused about what this weapon is, or they've just got this intelligence. I'm like, but they already know this. But actually, if you watch it carefully, they don't fully know it. They have bits of the story, and anyway, they need confirmation, right? What they really need is the whole thing about Rogue One is getting the verification that this is true.
Yeah.
And so the two do actually meld together. And anyway, the writer, sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but the writer of the last 3 episodes said, in Rogue One, the bit on Ring of Kafrene where Cassian meets Tivok and shoots him was really a character beat, right? The whole point of that was Cassian's prepared to shoot someone, and he's a new type of rebel. You haven't really seen that. And it is a crucial point for that movie and a point for Cassian's character within the ambit of Rogue One. And they said when we were trying to retcon it to make Andor fit, that was the crucial piece of information, that actually the first time we see Cassian is when he meets Tivok on Ray of Kafrene. So we have, and we know he's connected to Saw, and we have to kind of work back from that to make it all line up. And I thought it did. I thought it was pretty effective.
And it's a really nice throwback to the very beginning of Andor, the series in which Cassian's homicide is intentional and strategic and designed to forward a political cause, whereas the first homicide that we see is a kind of emotional reaction where he loses his temper and kills the corpos.
And we are back to wrap up our discussion of Rogue One in the light of Andor. Jeff, I had a sort of thesis statement paragraph about this text writ large, Andor and Rogue One, as it relates to the larger Star Wars kind of universe. And I want to see if you buy this or you think I'm off in the wrong direction.
Yes.
So my sense, yes, I'm definitely off in the wrong direction. Thank you. All right, and so see you next time. No. Let me at least read it before you shoot it down. Andor Rogue One, taken as a collective text, achieves a category shift for Star Wars from fantasy to science fiction and from family entertainment to a serious political text. And I think it's obvious how this happened, which is generations of creative people, Tony Gilroy, Gareth Edwards, Rian Johnson, grew up with the original movies. And then once Lucas's grip was kind of removed from the franchise, this generation takes the creative reins and they've fashioned a text that satisfies their sensibilities as grown fans. Mm-hmm. And that's, so do you buy that? There's a category shift and it's largely from that cause.
Yes, I do. I would characterize this as the transformation of a George Lucas dominated and controlled creative product to the emergence of Star Wars and the Star Wars universe as a folk product.
Folk, F-O-L-K.
F-O-L-K.
Okay.
Folk. It's a story that now belongs writ large to audiences who are not George Lucas. And, there's a ton of, intrigue and backbiting and lawsuits, and there's all the commercial stuff involving the transfer of the Lucas storytelling world to Disney. But effectively what that accomplishes is that it opens the universe to all kinds of different people, including people like Tony Gilroy, who claims he really was not a fan of Star Wars. And this is what happens with folk characters, with folk stories, with all forms of folk entertainment, is that these are things that last generation after generation after generation. And to the extent that they do enter into the genre of being folk entertainment or folk culture, it's exactly that they are now seen as these kinds of broader storytelling templates full of recognizable characters who are just loose and vague enough that they can be reformulated, reworked. New kinds of stories can be told using these characters, and these stories will inevitably respond to the concerns of new generations of creators and audiences. How that fits into a transformation from fantasy to science fiction or vice versa, I'm perfectly willing to accept that you're right on that. To me, the thing that feels more germane is the movement of this storytelling universe from out of proprietary hands of George Lucas into a much wider universe of creation.
Okay. All right, great. I think we should bring this to a close. As always, these are just our understandings, our reflections on the text. We've learned a lot from the comments section throughout Andor. We'd love it if you would share your reflections with us. We'd also love to know, what are you watching now? What are you watching next? What do you see as some analogous or adjacent texts to Andor? We're always looking for these kind of recommendations and so forth. And so on that bombshell,